It is an absolute pleasure to be moderating this panel today on interfaith discussions about life and death, because in our sessions prior to this event, we talked about the fact that we're not just talking about death, but we're talking about life. And life is where we think about and prepare for our deaths. And so that's a very important component. And one of the things that we decided to do was to address life and death across the spectrum in relation to everyone's religious, spiritual, or human tradition. And so I'm going to ask a series of questions that span that spectrum. And we are going to have our panelists address one or two questions as we go. And so sometimes those questions will be woven together and sometimes they'll be separate. We thought that this would be the most interesting and coherent way for us to proceed. So I'll begin by introducing myself. My name is Susan Srigley, and I am a professor of religions and cultures at Nipissing University in North Bay, Ontario, Canada. And I am currently teaching and working and living, but also presenting to you on the territory of the Robinson-Huron Treaty of 1850 and the lands of the Nipissing First Nation and the traditional territory of the Anishinaabeg. And I'm grateful to be here and to be working on these lands and to be sharing this conversation with all of you today. So on this point of, life and death and preparing for death in life, I thought I'd start us off by a quote from Ram Dass's book, Walking Each Other Home, where he says, "If I am going to die, the best way to prepare is to quiet the mind and open the heart. And if I am going to live, the best way to prepare is to quiet the mind and to open the heart." And I'm wondering if there might be a sense in which this may be applicable to all of the varied traditions who are here today, represented by these fine folks. We'll see as our conversation unfolds. So to begin with our first question, I would like to start with the question of how does your tradition prepare for death in life? And I will begin by asking Rebekah to start us off with that question. And so I'm going to let each panelist introduce themselves to you and let you know where they are coming from.
Thank you. My name is Rebekah Domer. I am a member of the Bruderhof community, an international fellowship of families and celibate members committed to practicing the teachings of Jesus in daily life. Like the early Christians, we share everything. Each member gives all they have in service to God and neighbor. In return, the community provides and cares for its members from the cradle to the grave. Our life is rooted in the teachings of Jesus, who brought the good news of the kingdom of God. In God's kingdom, the meek will be exalted, the poor lifted up, and there will be peace and justice for all. We believe that our earthly existence is a foreshadowing of the life we will experience in the future kingdom of God. But our planet will be part of his kingdom, along with the invisible worlds that we cannot yet see with our human eyes. Jesus came to show us what God's kingdom of love looks like, and he calls his disciples to follow him in making that kingdom a reality among people by dedicating our lives in service to others. Jesus proclaimed that whenever we do the smallest deed of love for another human being, his kingdom breaks in, as his kingdom is ultimately love. We believe that human life is a gift from God and that we are sent to this earth to give and receive love, each of us in a completely unique way that can never be replicated. In so doing, we each express a unique aspect of God's love in human form. Jesus indicated that we will be asked to account to God for how we use the earthly lives he gives us. Did we invest our gifts and talents in loving service to others? If our lives are entrusted to us as a gift from God, they must be well invested in preparation for death and eternal life. In the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 5, Jesus exhorts us to keep our lamps filled with oil, each drop consisting of deeds of love done to others. At the end of time, Jesus will ask us if we fed the hungry, clothed the naked, and visited those who are sick or in prison. Whatever we have done to the least of these, he tells us, we have done for him. It therefore follows that the best preparation for death is to live our lives well, reaching out in love and helping those around us. We believe that the love we experience as human beings will continue after death in some form. Therefore, physical death is not the end of life. Rather, the soul is freed from the confines of our earthly bodies, able to experience the vast perspectives of life without the limits of space and time. By the same token, if God's kingdom is made up of pure love, we must seek to be filled with love while alive on earth, so that nothing separates us from God's love in the next life. It is of vital importance to be freed from our sinful nature through repentance and forgiveness while on earth, so that our souls are unblemished when they meet God. Jesus atoned for our sins, and through him we can be forgiven and made pure. Thus, at the Bruderhof, we seek God's and one another's forgiveness daily, so that we are ready to meet God with free and joyful hearts whenever our time comes. Human life is a gift to be celebrated. We should embrace it thankfully in all its richness and beauty, while tending it well. Jesus encouraged us to seek imperishable treasures in heaven instead of focusing our lives on the pursuit of fleeting wealth and pleasure. I believe the treasures in heaven of which Jesus speaks are the encounters we have with other people and the love we share while alive on earth. The fruit of a life lived joyfully for others is the peace of God, which surrounds a soul as it prepares to die. Death is ultimately a homecoming. St. Augustine suggests that our hearts are restless until they rest in God. Therefore, death is a return to our eternal home, where we will continue life in some form, united with our Creator and free of the boundaries of space and time that confine us here on earth. The renowned painter Vincent van Gogh once commented that life is only a kind of sowing time, and the harvest is not here. If we sow abundantly while on earth, we can look forward to reaping a rich harvest in the life to come. Finally,
I'll let you say your finally, but we have to pay attention to time.
Finally, in the words of Bengali poet Tagore, death is not extinguishing the light, it is only putting out the lamp, because the dawn has come.
Thank you very much, Rebekah. Sorry, I am the one who is going to have to cut you off if we go over time, because we have a huge panel of folks here, and I want to make sure everyone has a chance to speak. Thank you, Rebekah. So I'm going to ask the same question to Nabil. How does your tradition prepare for death in life?
Thank you, Susan. I'd also like to just start by thanking the organizers of this event for this panel discussion. It's a fascinating topic, and how wonderful to hear different perspectives on this theme. Well, we believe that to better understand how to prepare for death, we need to reflect upon how we prepared for life. When we were in the wombs of our mothers, we prepared for the world outside of the womb by developing our limbs, our organs, and our other physical faculties. We developed our eyes, but there was no light with which we could see anything in the womb. We developed our legs, but the womb is not a place where you can walk. But the womb was the perfect place to begin the development of these physical faculties. And if we hadn't just started to develop them in the womb, it would have been very challenging to do so after birth. And we believe that in the womb, our spirit or our soul becomes attracted to and associated with our body, and that this soul or human spirit really is our essential defining characteristic. We believe that the soul is a divine emanation, a divine spark, and is possessed by every human being, and that this is the true meaning and wisdom of the passage in Genesis, that we are all made in the image of God. Now, although we believe that the absolute essence of God is unknowable, each one of us has the capacity to reflect or manifest all of the qualities or attributes of God in an intensely unique way. And just as the womb was the perfect place to develop our physical faculties, this world is the perfect place to develop our spiritual faculties. And this is the true purpose of life. In this world, we can nurture our souls by studying and meditating upon the beauty of creation, because every atom of existence has been ordained for the education and training of our souls. And that is why we believe that the pursuit of science, as well as art, is in itself an act of worship. But we also need to exercise our free will to develop virtues and divine attributes, such as love, kindness, compassion, patience, gratitude, humility, forgiveness, mercy, justice, trustworthiness, and truthfulness, which is the foundation of all the other virtues. But we can only do this by actively engaging in fellowship with one another, loving one another, and serving one another, as Rebekah mentioned. By doing so, we become more intensely human, more authentic, more conscious. Indeed, to be worthy of the station of being human, we must dedicate ourselves to serving all of humanity. There can be no other. So the inevitability of death reminds us that the purpose of our lives is to polish the mirror of our hearts from the dust of pride, envy, and greed, so that we can become more virtuous, we can love and serve one another, and become more truly alive, and better prepared to continue our eternal journey after our soul is no longer associated with our body. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nabil. That was wonderful. Okay, so same question, new person. Nina, may I call on you to answer how your tradition prepares for death and life? You're muted, Nina.
Yes, so as I was saying, my name is Nina Buchanan, and as a student of the Brahma Kumaris World Spiritual University, for the past 25 years, I practice and teach meditation, as well as being a personal and spiritual development coach. And together with these activities, I am a humanist funeral celebrant and family dynamics coach. So in answer to the question, how does my tradition prepare people for death in life? So intrinsic to our spiritual knowledge is that living and dying are inextricably linked, different sides of the same coin, and that change is the only constant. The whole concept of doors, for example, is for entering something new and for leaving something old. Life and death is entering one room and leaving one room and entering another. And the quality of our journey, as the two speakers have said, from each room to the next depends on how we live our lives in the now. As we live, so we die. And embedded in our tradition is the importance of course, living consciously and dying consciously, which means that we are embracing the cyclical nature of the changes in the human experience, which ultimately leads to our transition, in other words, death. And so built into every aspect of our daily spiritual teachings and practice is the notion of living consciously and dying consciously. As human souls, we don't have much to say about when and how we die, but we do get to decide how we live life, which influences the quality of our outward journey. For example, just as a productive day brings a restful night's sleep, a life consciously lived brings a peaceful closure, and this influences the soul's level of enlightenment for its onward journey. This means that our final state of mind leads us to our appropriate destination. So, how do we put into practice these traditions in preparing people for death in life? Essentially, our spiritual practice is seeing the self and others as not being the body, but being a soul. Practicing detachments in letting go of old, outmoded habits such as a precursor to self-empowerment. It is indeed a form of dying alive, letting go of learned behaviors and acquired values that create stress in our lives. Our daily spiritual teachings function as a tool to keep us engaged in living a values-based life that will lead to the acceptance of death, such as described by the other speakers. So what do some of the outcomes of this practice look like for us? I know and have heard of a number of people in their senior years who've hosted a life celebration and Thanksgiving ceremony to which all their friends and loved ones are invited to participate in a pre-end of life celebration. As opposed to the tribute being read for the deceased at a funeral ceremony, the individual in this circumstance speaks on his or her own behalf with love and appreciation for the life they lived, and thanking everyone for the roles they played in their lives. In addition, each participant or each invitee gets the chance to honor the individual. And of course, there's a lot of laughter, humor, and lightness interspersed with music of the individual's choice, and ends with a celebratory meal. I was very blessed to attend one such event and was extremely touched by the spirit of celebration and outpouring of appreciation, love, and happiness. So these types of celebrations, they function to bring people together in a context where they can reflect on their own journey within the cycle of life, as well as making the world a better place. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Nina, for sharing that with us. And the last person to speak to this question about how your tradition prepares for death and life is John. And then when we move on to the next question, John's going to start us off because his 2 points are connected, as it seems is necessarily the case, that in many ways all these ideas are woven together. So I'm going to turn it over to John to answer the first question.
Thanks, Susan, and thanks to Rebekah, because you've actually summarized Catholic belief perfectly, Rebekah. I just want to add the Benedictine idea, which is that you contemplate death throughout your life. So you would hear of monks actually disappearing in the monastery. Where are they? They're in the graveyard. Cardinal Hume, when he was headmaster at Ampleforth College, was asked, "What do you teach the boys?" And he answered, "We teach them how to die." And I think that is really getting ready to die, so that when you die, you can look back on your life and say, I've done my best. I've done all that I can do. And I think actually that applies to all of us. I might be wrong, but it seems to me everybody wants to have a good death. I want to talk a little bit about my teacher, because I was brought up in South Africa in a wonderful family and in the Anglican tradition. And I became a Catholic when I came to London, when I met my wife, who was a cradle Catholic. And we met up with John East, who was my music teacher at school. He's the last of my teachers still alive, and he conducted the choir at our funeral, our wedding. And we used to see him at the Proms. And I found out that he just had his 90th birthday and he was in the hospice. So I went straight there. I must say I was dreading it, because I thought, I'm going to have to say lots of prayers. I'm going to have to be terribly holy. It was all nonsense. All I had to do was just be there. And I think that was the biggest lesson of the lot, just having to be there, not having to say much at all. And we actually set up a rota of his friends to be with him. And just sitting there quietly. And one of his friends brought me a copy of The Dream of Gerontius by Newman. I've never read the poem, but I knew Elgar's oratorio very well. I've sung it many times. It's actually my favorite thing. And at one point, John woke up and I said to him, John, do you remember that bit at the beginning of part 2 of Gerontius where Elgar has this beautiful music and it's just like the soul is passing quietly? And he said, oh, yes. And I took a radio in, and so he could listen to Radio 3 because he couldn't get it on the TV in the hospice. And I think he appreciated that greatly, that he could listen to classical music. At the very end, all he said to me, I asked him, I said, have you had communion? Because I'd been in touch with the chaplain. And he said, oh, later, John, later. This is very important to us, and this leads on to the second question about the whole idea of the last rites, because we want to make confession. If it's possible, we want to receive Eucharist. We want to be ready to meet God. And this brings me on to Sir David Amos, MP. I think we're going to get a change in the law, because the fact that his priest was excluded from going into that murder scene is such a terrible shock for us as Catholics. He should have had the priest with him, and the priest should be seen as an emergency worker. Anyway, to go back to John, the last thing he said to me was, thank you. And on the Saturday, I had to go to Liverpool, and I went out to the convent to see another old friend, Sister Mary Pierre, who's also 90. Turns out she's a great friend of John East. So we're sitting there chatting about John and saying some prayers for him. Found out afterwards, that's the moment he died. So it's like we were accompanying him, even though we were in Liverpool. I think that this whole thing of the faithful being together and actually as a body supporting each other, I felt this very much when my parents died and we had a double funeral. And like the network came together in Sydney to support us. That was very much God working through the faithful, because I do have very strong faith. I believe in the resurrection. I believe that we will live after we die, and that my parents were received by God as well done, good and faithful servants. So I am very grateful to have been given this faith as a child and actually nurtured it. And when my parents died, I realized why I'd gone to church every Sunday, why I go to Mass. It was setting me up, getting me ready for when the terrible thing was going to hit me. So that's what I'd like to share with you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, John. And so did you weave that other question about the practices in, or did you have more to say about that?
Kind of weaved it in there, Susan. I was trying to get the idea of the last rites and the priest coming to the person dying, how important that is, and what a blessing it is if you can get someone into the hospice. It's not always easy to get people in the hospice, but I think the fact that he was in the Catholic hospice was where Cardinal Hume died. That made a huge difference, because he was surrounded by all these people supporting him. Yeah,
very important. Thank you so much for sharing that. Okay, so to continue with this question of what are some practices that happen at the bedside during the dying process, or what is important in different traditions for this transition? And so I'd like to call on Charlie to answer this question. Thank you, Charlie.
Thank you. How long do we have per person, please?
You're just answering one question? Is that correct? Yes. So you have 7 minutes.
Okay, I'm going to put a timer on.
Not to be too precise, but...
I'm going to bring some order to proceedings. Okay, hello, my name is Charlie Morley, and I'm talking today in my capacity as a Buddhist chaplain. I lived at the Kagyu-Samazon Buddhist Center in London for 7.5 years. And my day job is I write books and run courses on the lucid dreaming tradition and practices within Tibetan Buddhism. The reason I chose to answer this question, and also I'm a member of the Bardo group. So the Bardo group is a group of volunteers headed by Lama Zangmo, who's the Lama who runs the Buddhist center where I lived. And we offer funeral services, end-of-life care, after-death care for Buddhists or people with a Buddhist predilection. The reason I wanted to answer this question is because it's one that I have engaged very recently. So although I have assisted at the bedsides of 2 dying people before, it was only a couple of weeks ago, it was November the 11th, Remembrance Day, that a friend of mine died. And he was actually a Buddhist chaplain himself. He was the person who got me into Buddhist chaplaincy, and he had asked me to do his bedside rites when he died. And it was the first time that I had done it kind of by myself as the lead chaplain. And it was a friend. So it was very significant, probably one of the most significant moments of my life. So I'd like to run you through exactly what we did in that process. Now for Keith, his name is Keith Mackenzie. I want you to know his name. He was a brilliant man. Keith was in a medically induced coma. He got COVID and had some underlying health conditions too. It was decided when his kidneys began to fail that the life support would be removed at a certain time. Now, from the point of view of the after-death rites, this made it actually perfect for what we could do. Keith had a list of things that he would like to happen, and we were able to engage all of them. So this is a real and ideal bedside after-death rites and kind of during death rites. Lots of people wouldn't have this whole thing, but with Keith, we managed to do the whole thing. So within Buddhism, there's a belief that there's the last respiration, which is where there's medical death. And then about 20 minutes later is where there's kind of actual death. So you have this period in between, and there are certain practices that can be done then. And when I arrived at the bedside of Keith, we had mantras playing. So certain prayers associated with the medicine Buddha, which is a enlightened archetype to do with healing. So those are playing on a speaker by his bedside while he's in the coma. It's said to be very good to be listening to these before death. Then when the life support was removed and the breathing tube was the last thing to go, and he began to die, the mantras were switched off, and he was now surrounded by his 2 boys and his wife and his ex-wife too. And they were then telling him that it's okay to go and sending him love. Again, the perfect things to hear. You want to be allowed to let go. And then when his final breath was breathed, while that was happening, I was sitting on a chair practicing something called Tonglen, which is a practice where you imagine that you're breathing in the pain, the suffering, the illness of another, transforming it at the heart, and then breathing out love and healing towards them. That's a really good thing to do by the bedside of someone who's dying. When his last breath occurred, his son was so brilliant, who knew his wishes. He literally said, "Okay, Dad, over to Charlie now." And at the time that the last respiration happens, it's really ideal if you can whisper certain words into the ear of the person who has now died or is in the process of dying. And these are not to be afraid, to know that you are safe, to know that the appearances are projections of your own mind, because you start to kind of hallucinate all the tunnel of light and all that kind of stuff. We want to acknowledge that's hallucination. And the third instruction, go towards the brightest light you can see. It's believed that when the mind shuts down at death and this kind of light show begins, one of those lights is exceedingly bright and white. That is divinity. That is your true nature. So it's said to go towards the bright light. So we were able to whisper that in his ear. After that was whispered in his ear, we laid over what's called the Mandala Blanket. This is like a shroud. So imagine, like the shroud of a Turin or something like that, very thin material. And on that shroud are a series of mandalas and images of Buddha and certain Sanskrit text. And that's laid over the body very specifically. So you want to get the Buddha right over the chakra there. There's another wheel that goes over the, you kind of wrap around over the crown chakra, one over the heart, all the way down to the legs. So you get that in perfect position. which his sons helped me do. It was wonderful. They were able to be so actively involved in this. And then I sat by the bedside and began the prayers. And the prayers were done in Tibetan. These are prayers of swift rebirth, prayers of moving towards that light. There's also a dedication where you think of all the good things that person did before they died, and then you dedicate it to all beings. Now, by this time, his sons had called in the rest of the family. Now, I wasn't used to doing this with an audience, but there were now over 10 people around the bedside, and I was doing these prayers in Tibetan. And I saw his dad. Keith wasn't a particularly young guy. He was late 50s, 60s maybe. His dad was there, who was definitely in his advanced 80s. And I saw him tapping along to one of the Tibetan tunes, because one of them is quite lively. And I looked up and I realized they want to be involved. So I stopped and I started saying all the prayers in English. Now, that's not traditionally done, but I knew in the moment that needed to be done. They wanted to understand what I was saying. And then when the next mantra recitation came and I saw his old dad still tapping along, I said, you can say this too. If you want to say this with me, say Om Mani Padme Hum, Om Mani Padme Hum. And they were then chanting along. We had the whole family involved. It was really beautiful, beautiful moment. So certain prayers that are said, then a dedication of the life. So I asked again all the family members to be involved in this. Think back to everything good that Keith did in his life. I want you to hold that in your mind, and I want you to say with me, we dedicate any and all of the benefit of Keith Mackenzie's life to all sentient beings. And we did this together. And then there are more kind of prayers in Tibetan and stuff like that. One of the main things too is that the body is left untouched for 4 hours after death. And the ICU nurses and doctors were so brilliant in allowing us to do that. So after last respiration, the only touch of the body should be the Mandala Blanket. Once the Mandala Blanket's on, the body should be untouched for 4 hours after death. And again, the family were brilliant. I was saying, in the Buddhist tradition, before that last respiration, you can grab him, you can hug him, you can tell him you love him, all those things. But after that last respiration, it'd be really good if you don't kind of throw yourself at the body and this kind of stuff. And they were so brilliant. And so the practice has continued for another hour or so. They were involved, certain offerings, lighting of, we couldn't light candles in incense, so we offered candles and incense that were in unlit form. The ceremony continued for another hour or so, and then we stayed with the body until just before the 4 hours were up. The reason that the 4 hours is there, because it's believed that the mind stream, so not the soul, not the spirit, the specific word in Buddhism, mind stream, separates from the gross corporeal form at the point of death, but it can take up to 4 hours for that separation to occur. So it's really good to leave the body to rest for those 4 hours. So those were the after death practices that were done for Keith Mackenzie recently. And yeah, that's an example of what is done at the time of death. And then for the next 49 days, there are certain practices that are done because it's believed there is a transition that can take a maximum of 49 days to occur after death. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Charlie. Fascinating. When I teach Buddhism in my death classes at the university, the students are always very intrigued by the details of this process and this very guided practice that's happening.
Yeah, Buddhists really do death. They don't really do marriages, don't really do christenings, but death, that's where they come into play.
Top notch. Absolutely. Thank you so much for sharing that. Okay, so we have another person to answer this question, which is the rituals or rites after a death has occurred. No, sorry, we're still on practices during the dying process. And Kat Webb is going to answer this question for us now. Thanks, Kat.
Hi, I'm Kat Webb, and I am coming to this from not necessarily a religious tradition. I'm coming to this as a spiritualist and an animist. And this basically means that I believe that there is a spirit and a story to how things become the way that they are. And there is a spirit and an energy to each person and object and animal and tree and stone. And they all carry their own currents and energies with them. And so where I come into the work is through the word psychopomp. So psychopomp is a Greek word, basically psyche, soul, spirit, spark, the essence of the person. And then pomp is the leader or guide of a procession. So as a psychopomp, my work is identifying spirits after they have left their corporeal body behind, and then assisting that process to get them to the gate safely. And I've always been like this way. Since I was a little kid, I was the kid who saw the ghosts. And so my work comes from this place, understanding the first law of thermodynamics, which states that energy cannot be created or destroyed, only transferred. There is an animating force that exists. And so big pieces that are important around question number 2, and the big things that are important around the transition point for me is making sure that people are receiving affirming care. As a queer, there is a certain lack of representation due to a history of ostracization of queers from religious spaces. And so my work is to address those gaps, to make sure that people are not sitting alone in their existential dread, and making sure that there's some space for them to process their feelings around their mortality without it necessarily needing a religious context to it. And so while I have my own particular faith and beliefs, it's not something that I bring to the table with my clients or the people that I'm educating, because I really do believe that whether you want to call it a soul or just an animating force, there is something that exists when we are alive that does not exist after we pass. And so the things that are really important to me around this topic are we affirming who this person was and what they actually believed? A lot of times people default to their family of origins religion, and they're given rights in ways that may not affirm that person. And so creating a space for that human, that very vibrant personality to be witnessed in their fullness is really, really important at transition. Witnessing them and allowing space for them to be who they are and to be connected to the ideas and concepts that were really important to them in life is really important at that moment, is just to witness their fullness of spirit.
Thank you so much, Kat. Okay, we are turning to a new question, which is, what are some rituals or rites that happen after death has occurred? And I'm going to call on June to start us off with that question, and then Sally.
I'm a priest in the Church of England, and I actually am very blessed in taking funerals. They vary a great deal in the Church of England because we are the established church. And so people who have nowhere else to go usually end up at our doors. So we get a mixture of people, some of whom we know extremely well, and some of whom we scarcely know at all. If I'm privileged to be at the bed of the dying, immediately after the person has died, I will do the anointing of the 5 areas of the body and try and keep peace in the room. It's a complicated situation because as the priest, you have a responsibility for 2 things that are happening. One is the passing of the soul over, and the other is the grieving of the people who are left behind. So one is constantly managing 2 groups of people. I make sure before I do anything to do with the dying and the dead that I have my own angels around me and have already prayed to call the angels into the room so that they will be there helping all of us in this complicated area. I too will leave a period of silence at that time, and then when I feel that the soul is ready to leave, I will say, "Go forth upon thy journey, Christian soul." And there is quite often a sense of the soul passing then, but being still present. There then comes the complicated time of arranging the funeral with the family. This can be very complicated. And sometimes the first funeral I took, 2 bits of the family had fallen out. This became acute, and one area of the family threatened to burn down the house of the other if the coffin didn't pass along the right road. So you often see all of the tensions in the family revealed at this point. Since COVID, we have the privilege of Zoom, and this often involves making sure that the stream will go across the world. And in one case, very recently, that it would reach one of the family who was in the local prison. So making sure that that would be, that's marvelous that we have now this huge web. The discussion usually is around the music to be used, which once upon a time would have been largely hymns, now is largely recorded music, and the choice of music that the person who's died and that the family would want. Similarly, readings, once upon a time they would have been biblical, now they're often verses that people have chosen or indeed written. There is the possibility of a vigil all night, and sometimes the coffin is taken into the church for the night and people stay there for an overnight vigil. The discussion of the language to be used is also complex. Some people want the traditional language. I prefer to use Mother, Father, God, which I will always use when I finally touch the coffin. We commit our dear brother and sister into the hands of dear Mother, Father, God. For some people that's acceptable, for others it isn't. The sermon is tricky when you don't know the person. I usually make it based in the wonderful text. What does the Lord require of thee but to do justly, to love mercy, to work humbly with thy God, which in general you can fit most people's lives somewhere into that sort of frame. So even if the rest of the service isn't biblical, then there will be a biblical part in the sermon. The pattern is always that there is sometimes a service in the church followed by the crematorium, sometimes a service in the church followed by a grave, sometimes a service in the church, and then the coffin is crated up and taken to the airport to be buried in places like Ghana, Guyana, and so on. All of those require different organizations, which are relatively complex. All the time, I'm trying to keep the people together with the soul passing over. So keeping the angels guarding the soul and looking to see how it is all working together. The church service starts with the entrance of the coffin, often with biblical phrases, a welcome to people, penitential, saying what we're sorry for, particularly in relation to the person who has died, and allowing them to be sorry and not to feel that everything should be all right, allowing things like anger in the grief to be there. Then we have prayers, which are usually a memorialization and also for the grieving. So again, looking at those two. And then the eulogies. These are the unpredictable bit of the service, because sometimes there may be only 2 in the service order, but there are 22 waiting to come up. At one point, I had to play the organ for the end of the service because the organist had to leave because there were 20 eulogies to be done. One of these was wonderful, where a young man, Grandma was lying in an open coffin, and he said, "Grandma, you know that I've done everything you told me that was wrong, and look what a mess of my life, but I'm telling you now," looking at her coffin, "I'm not going to do it again." And you could see this was a moment of immense transformation in the eulogy for Grandma, who was in an open coffin. The open coffin is often very powerful. Some people like the coffin shut, some open. Now they all have to be shut during COVID. With the open coffin, there's often a procession around it with people putting things in the coffin in some way or other, touching the person and so on. That's often in Afro-Caribbean funerals. Even if the coffin is shut, then people will often want to touch it. Then we've got nearly to the end of the service, and we commend the person into the love of Mother, Father, God. And then from then on, the coffin goes in whichever way it's going next, and we get to the graveside. At the graveside, I usually bring in much more of the natural world. So I'll use a blessing, which is, may green be the grass you walk on, blue be the skies above you, and so on. So I will start to bring the natural world into it. The graveside itself can be very risky, particularly lately, because many of the graves are flooded, and there's a danger that the grave will collapse before the coffin has gone in. I learned from a rabbi in the States that she has a ceremonial pair of Wellingtons, which I've now invested in order to manage the burials. The notion of songs for the Afro-Caribbean community, this can last for an hour with songs going on and on and on and so on. It is the stage of committal into the earth, and sometimes, well, I will almost certainly throw earth in, but I always take a basket of rosemary with me so that anybody can take a piece of rosemary and throw it in with the earth and say whatever they like, in a sense, about the person. Like, thank you, Dad, you've been wonderful. That sort of area. The rosemary is wonderful. And often the nature of the funeral, often the Afro-Caribbean funeral, is very lively and very loud, whereas some of the other funerals are much softer. Then the person will be prayed for in the church in the intercessions for a period of time, usually several months. My Afro-Caribbean people will expect me to go back into the house several weeks after it and take the holy water, take the incense, lead a service there to make sure that the soul is passing on. All the time in my own mind, I am watching and listening for the passing of the soul, encouraging the soul to leave and not to stay around. And of course, every service, at the end of the service, we have a standard statement that I use in the prayers after the service. May the souls of the faithful rest in peace and rise in glory. It's a great privilege to sit on the edge between the living and the dying and make sure that you take care both of the living and of the passing of the soul of the dying. In my experience, this sometimes happens quite quickly, but sometimes it's quite slow. And the notion that you have that responsibility. It seems strange to say that I like taking funerals, but it always regarded as one of the most privileged places that I have, things that I have to do in my priesthood. Thank you.
Thank you so much, June, for walking us through that beautiful process. You know, it's interesting that we spend a lot of time right now talking about advance directives and making sure we have all our legal implications and legal documents in order when it comes to preparation for death. But I would like to advocate for the importance of spiritual directives. What are our spiritual directives? What do we want when we're in that process of dying? You know, the things that you are describing, Charlie's account and your account, June, of that process is just so beautiful. But we have to prepare for that. We have to have the guides. We have to have the people there who know we want that to make sure it happens. And I think that, like you said, you're at that thinning of the veil. You're in that edge state between life and death. And it's a privilege and it's an honor to be part of that. But I think that the more people hear about these kinds of stories who perhaps have no religious or traditional spiritual background might see the real significance of spiritual directives. I think it's really important.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you. And so, Sally, why don't you take us through some practices?
Sure. Hello. I'm coming at this from the Jewish tradition. I've been a member of our Chevra, what's called a Chevra Kadisha, translated as the Holy Society. And men prepare men for burial and women prepare women for burial. And what I'd like to start with is just take you through what actually happens from the point of death to preparing the body for the actual funeral. And it is my funeral. I will lie on a cold metal table. A sheet will cover my still, naked body. It will be tranquil in the room. 4 holy women of the Chevra Kadisha, the burial society, will wash their hands, dry them with paper towels, and pat their splayed palms with talcum powder. This helps to slide on the 2 sets of latex gloves that they will wear. In a quiet murmur, each one will say the designated blessings for the task ahead. No words other than brief instructions will be said. And so will begin the preparations for my burial. The women will remove any vestiges of death's bureaucracy, a name tag from the hospital, perhaps remaining bandages or tubes. As I lie flat, one woman will stand on the right side, another on my left, and the third behind my head, gently supporting it lest it rolls. The 4th woman will ensure that things are done correctly and pass relevant instruments to the others at the right time. 3 women will delicately lift the sheet, stand behind it, and the 4th will pull at a specially placed shower head and spray me with water from my head to my toes as I lie on my back. Keeping my modesty preserved is considered a sacred act, and so the sheet will be draped back onto my body. Whenever it does not need to be exposed, my body will be covered. Then the woman on my left will heave my body over to the right side, and one of the other women will take the shower head and spray me with water as I lie side on. The water will pass over my hair and my face. My arm will be lifted so that the water reaches under my arms and trickles onto my breast. The water will continue to drizzle to the tips of my toes. The process will be repeated as they heave my body onto the left side. Lying flat again and covered as much as possible, the woman on my right will clean my nails on my right hand and foot. On the left, the woman will clean the nails on my left hand and foot. My hands and feet will be quickly washed again. The woman standing by my head will gently comb my exposed hair. Any strands of hair will be collected and put in the coffin. She will remove any detritus still in my mouth or my nostrils. The wet sheets that have been covering me will be thrown to one side, and immediately in its stead, a clean, dry sheet will be put over me again. They will all ritually wash their hands again and don a fresh set of gloves. There's a vat of rainwater purchased on a specially designated contraption above the metal table. Now that I've been cleaned physically with tap water, I will be ritually cleaned with rainwater, the same sort of water that is used to fill the mikveh, or the ritual bath, that is used by many women during their marriages, and is stopped at the point of menopause. Once again, 3 women will take the sheet off me and stand behind it. The woman standing at my head will release the lever that will tip the water onto my head. Holding onto the handle of the lever, she will slowly walk the length of my body, ensuring that the rainwater spills out of the vat and covers all of me. Where there is no machine, buckets of rainwater are filled and then emptied over the body. A short prayer will be said, and closing with the words Tahara, 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 which means pure, pure, pure. So this is a very very clear example of what actually happens to the body in that room, in the cemetery, just before you're buried. After that ritual cleaning, the body is dressed in shrouds, and we use very simple white shrouds. There's no embalming, there's no dressing up of the person or open casket, anything like that. And the idea is that we are all equal before God, before man. At the end of the day, no one gets a fancier outfit than anybody else. The clothes, sort of a simple white mask, a hat, robes. Women wear slightly different between men and women, but basically sort of a long jacket and long pants and like a dressing gown sort of covering. There are special knots that are used, the wrists and the ankles and around the waist. Actually, around the waist, the letter Shin, it's a 3-pronged letter which stands for the name of God, is created by these knots. And then the body is placed into the coffin. A couple of pillows are actually in the coffin, filled with sawdust, sort of symbolically to let one's head rest comfortably. The coffin sits in that room. The lid is placed on the coffin, and then a prayer is said. And in fact, the 4 women who have done this process ask for forgiveness. They ask, they say to the dead person, if we've hurt you in any way while we were preparing your body, please accept our apology. Really asking to bring some sort of closure to this process. You usually don't know the person that you're, maybe coincidentally you know the person that you're preparing for burial, but usually you don't. And it's very much a sort of very silent in the room. The task is done, and then you just move on. You may attend the burial, or you would just go home after the work is done. So that's sort of the main essence of what happens in terms of the Jewish preparation for a burial, which we try, like those in the Muslim tradition, try and bury as soon as possible, ideally within the first 24 hours. It's not always practical if the close relative needs to fly in from abroad or there's some complication, but it's usually done very quickly. So I hope that gives you a flavour of a Jewish burial.
Thank you. Thank you, Sally. That's a fascinating account and really interesting. And I've also taught that practice in one of my classes. And I think the students are just in awe of the ceremony of it and this powerful silent ritual of these women doing this work. So thank you for taking us through that. Okay, so next we're gonna jump ahead to question 4, which is, what is the idea of what happens in the transition after death in your tradition? And I'm going to call on Jeremy to answer question 4. And then while he's answering question 4, he's also going to answer question 3, which was, what are some rituals after death has occurred? So clearly those two are related, but he's going to start with 4. Jeremy?
Thanks, Susan, and thanks for those who organised this event, which I think is very, very worthwhile, and very interested to hear what other people have said. So I'm a humanist, and so we look at this subject in a very, very different way to what we've heard so far. But I think you'll see that in terms of pre-death, if you like, there's a lot of similarities. So I better say what I mean by humanism. So the humanists, and most humanists like this, big thing is looking at science and evidence to understand the universe, being willing to change your mind if new stuff comes along, and so on. So most humanists, me included, don't believe in God. Some are agnostics, but most of them don't believe in God, or anything that we would consider as supernatural, or any unseen order. And of course that includes an afterlife as well. And now's not the time to talk about how you decide what's right and wrong, and we use empathy and reason for that as well. But one thing that has come up already in the discussion is about meaning and purpose. Now obviously, as a humanist, I don't think that the universe has any purpose. And I think meaning is a human thing that humans have created, but doesn't mean a humanist's life is not meaningful. Of course it is, and the way everybody, I think, to greater or lesser extent, gives their life meaning is through their relationships with other people, the people they love, the things that make their life rich, the things they enjoy doing, whether it's music or arts, or the occupations that they that they have. And in particular, one of the richest things of life, of course, is also being there for other people and helping other people. So seeking happiness and well-being, which includes well-being for others, is a very important thing for humanists. And I think Rebekah talked about fleeting pleasures and avoiding that. And I think I'd agree with that I think anybody who's thought about what makes a rich and fulfilled life recognizes that just piling up more money or buying a new car isn't something that gives you a lasting fulfillment and richness in life. It's usually down to your relationships that are the important thing. So anyway, all of that means that when it comes to matters of life and death, most humanists, I think that we just have one life, that this is it. And I know that all the other people here have a different view to that. And I think one of the important things to do, as we're in a plural society, is to be very respectful of the importance that those beliefs about end of life have for other people. And understanding that richness is one of the things that we're doing here. I mean, from my point of view, all the various forms of afterlife and reincarnation, I can understand why they're very powerful, attractive, and comforting ideas. But personally, I don't see any evidence that they're nice that they were true, but I don't see that they are true. So I think my belief is that my mind and my consciousness are products of my brain's activities. So I don't think there's a soul. There's a thing called Jeremy inhabiting my body, but these two are part of the same thing. Somebody referred to this analogy about what happens when you switch the light off. I think the light just goes out. I don't think it's wait for another greater light to come. I think it just the light goes out. So I think when I'm dead, and a humanist would think this, I think we'll think that when I'm dead, I think I'll be in exactly the same state as I was before I was conceived, that is, not existing. And the big difference, of course, is this brief passage through life. Hopefully we will at least have left some memories with others, and will have touched others' lives, and they will have touched ours. Now that might all sound rather austere, and but I don't find that depressing at all. In fact, quite the reverse. That I don't find eternal existence a particularly attractive prospect anyway. And what looking at things this way means is that if, as this is the one life we have, we really need to try and make the most of it and appreciate just what a wonderful thing this is, that we're able to we're experiencing it. So I don't see life as a preparation for death at all, any more than I see, the story of a novel a preparation for the end of the novel. I think the key thing is the content of the novel. Now, what's more difficult, of course, is and a lot more sad, is when the people we love die. And for that, we need the kindness and support of others. And for millennia, of course, people have found ceremony or ritual important in helping people come to terms with loss. It's a very important step on the way. So in that respect, a humanist funeral, and I should say I'm not a humanist funeral celebrant, but I know many people who are, of course, perform a similar function to a religious funeral. And the difference, I suppose, is that they're centered on the person who has died and those who are mourning. So person-centered is a big thing, and there isn't any fixed format or liturgy. What happens normally is the celebrant will normally go and spend quite a bit of time with the family to get an understanding of the person who's died, if they don't know them already, and how they would want the family would want them to be remembered. And what they then do after that, they go away and they write a script, and that's going to be the script of the funeral, and it will have in it, of course, whether people want to say readings or do eulogies and whatever it is. But the script is seen as belonging to the family, not to the celebrant. And they see it in advance. They can ask for changes to be made in it. And obviously, in some cases, somebody who knows that their death is approaching may actually talk to a celebrant in advance and say what they want, or even design the ceremony themselves, as somebody else has said. So the ceremony is always inclusive. And while a humanist celebrant obviously can't say a prayer, because that would be a hypocritical thing to do, if there's a person, a member of the family for whom that was important, then they can say a prayer, and that's absolutely fine. And I know people from cases where people from Islamic or Jewish backgrounds who've had humanist funerals themselves have the funeral ceremony has been followed by a traditional burial. I can think of one case I attended where there was a Jewish burial and as a burial afterwards, and then prayers were said over the grave. So there is no rule about what a humanist funeral will look like or what the ceremony would be, because it's really, really down to the individual. And what matters most really is being true to the person who's died, and the richness of their life, and celebrating that life, and being meaningful for the people who are left behind.
Thank you very much, Jeremy. Beautiful. I mean, I think that is in essence what we're talking about, right? Is being true to the person who has died, no matter their tradition. Okay, we're going to come back to Nabil for question number 4, which is, what is the idea of what happens in the transition after death in your tradition? Nabil.
Yeah, thank you, Susan. And also thank you, Jeremy. It's nice to get another perspective as well on this really fascinating topic. In the Baha'i writings, we find a quite startling statement from Baha'u'llah, the prophet founder of the Baha'i faith. He says that I have made death a messenger of joy to thee, wherefore dost thou grieve? I made the light to shed on thee its splendor, why dost thou veil thyself therefrom? Now, I find the statement quite interesting because most of us do not associate death with joy. But if you think about it, one of the most joyous experiences in life is birth. You know, the birth of a child is perhaps the most joyful and happy event a parent can experience. And perhaps Baha'u'llah associates death with joy because death and birth are perhaps similar type of events. You know, when we are born into this world, we leave the dark and narrow confines of the womb world, and we enter into a world which is infinitely greater. Likewise, we believe that when we die to this world, our soul is born into a world of disclosure, a world infinitely more vast and more real than this material universe. And we believe that after our physical death, there is a life review, and we will be able to see things more clearly, and that we ourselves will be able to estimate the worth of all of our deeds. And obviously, there'll be certain things to rejoice over, and perhaps other things that will cause us a grief. But fortunately, God's mercy exceeds God's justice. And we believe that we continue where we left off in our spiritual evolution on our journey towards God, that ultimate reality, that ultimate truth. And we believe that this journey is eternal and that the spiritual worlds of God are infinite. You know, the more we have developed our inner eye, our inner ear, our inner heart, the more we will be able to see, hear, feel, and experience in the next world. And I think as many of the panelists have explained, you know, we do that by becoming better human beings, by looking after each other, by loving each other, by serving each other. We also believe that we maintain our identity and individuality, and that we won't be swallowed up in one vast spirit. And I think in the Baha'i writings, we find some very powerful metaphors to convey this concept of the immortality of the soul. For example, the relationship between body and soul is likened to the relationship between a mirror and the sun. You know, the mirror is like the body and the sun is like the soul or the human spirit. You know, if the mirror is destroyed or it's shattered, you know, the light is not affected in any way. Another very powerful metaphor is the relationship between the bird and the cage. You know, our body is like the cage and the spirit is like the bird. If the cage becomes broken, the bird continues to exist. It is not annihilated. In fact, its feelings will be even more powerful, its perceptions greater, and its happiness even greater. And for the bird, there is no paradise greater than freedom from the cage. We believe that the next world is a much more interesting place. It's not such a boring place. I agree that if the next world were just like this world, I would agree with Jeremy, it would be a bit boring and maybe not worth it. But we believe that the world is an infinitely more vast and interesting place. And in that world, we are united with loved ones and friends, because love is such a potent magnet that not even death can separate those people who love one another. We believe that we will engage in conversations with other souls. I think we have this image of the next world as being a world in which people are sitting on clouds and strumming harps. And that doesn't sound very inviting, but I think actually the next world is much more exciting. We also believe that the next world is a realm filled with activity. It's a realm of mutual support, a realm of learning, and that departed souls that have become sanctified, you know, actually exercise an influence on this world and can act as a leaven or a catalyst for the arts and sciences in this world. And that we can pray for the souls in the next world, and they can also pray for us. Now, Jeremy raised a really interesting point about the lack of evidence, of the existence of the next world. And I think although the title of this wonderful conference is Lifting the Lid, I think the lid on what happens after death can only be partially lifted. You can imagine what would happen if you could somehow communicate to the embryo growing in the womb of the mother, and you tried to explain to the embryo how vast and interesting the world outside the womb was in comparison to the dark and narrow confines of the womb. The embryo would want to leave immediately, but that would not be healthy, because this world, like the womb world, is an important place for the development of our soul. However, I think there are a few hints that we're given about the possibility of the existence of the next world. And I think one of those hints is the dream. If you think about it, you're lying on your bed dreaming, and your hands are not moving, your lips are not moving, and yet you're traveling vast different distances, you're engaging in conversations, you're experiencing amazing things. And I'm sure all of us have also had the experience of deja vu, how we experience something later in life that we may have dreamed years before. Again, it's not absolute proof, but I think it's just a little hint that maybe opens the door to the possibility that there may be a whole other realm beyond this material world. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Nabil, for that. Beautiful. And now we're going to turn to one of our speakers who we have not yet heard from, Daniel Trott, to answer the next question that we are moving on to, which is, what are some practices of memorialization for the dead, and why do such memorializations matter? Daniel, we'll start with you.
Hi, I'm Daniel, and I'm a Christian priest in the Church of England in London. Christians, of course, take part in many of the practices of memorialization that are normal in the surrounding society, keeping pictures of the dead, visiting graves, doing something special on the date of death each year. And who's to say they're not religious things to do? But I think you probably want me to speak about specifically Christian practices of memorialization. And these probably begin with the funeral. But they may also end there. Protestant Christians especially may not do any specifically religious memorialization of the dead other than the funeral. Catholic Christians, however, and some Anglicans who feel more Catholic than Protestant, have often had further religious commemoration of the dead. For example, by arranging for a Eucharist, a Mass or a communion service, to be held in memory of the dead person on the 1-year anniversary of death, and maybe in future years as well. Most Catholic churches and some Anglican churches also keep a list of those connected with the church who have died, arranged by date. And in the prayers in church every Sunday, those whose anniversaries of death or years mind are coming up that week are prayed for. There's no time limit to this, and the names may stay on the list forever. As well as these specific memorials of individual people, many churches observe All Souls Day on the 2nd of November, when all the dead are commemorated. In my church, every October, we write to all the families that we've conducted funerals for in the previous few years, and many of them come to the service on the 2nd of November and hear their loved ones' names read out. We do this as part of a Eucharist, when we remember Jesus and share bread and wine together. And so we unite these two acts of memory together. We remember our loved ones in the context of remembering Jesus, who was remembered by God the Father and raised from the dead. And so it's a very hopeful form of memorialization, linked to remembering the resurrection of Jesus. And so you also asked, why do these forms of memorialization matter? First, they provide comfort, and that's important. Second, they remind us that the dead are still part of the community. Christians talk about the communion of saints, the unity of all Christians, living and departed. We're separated temporarily, but we'll all be united again, and that union is the greater truth. Remembering loved ones who've died is done alongside remembering those who are celebrated as saints. For the whole of November, since All Saints' Day on the 1st, my church has been full of icons, remembering quite visually that we're surrounded by the dead and that we worship alongside them. And that leads into a few words about what Christians are doing when they memorialize the dead. There are a variety of understandings of this within Christianity, but the important thing is that Christian memorialization isn't primarily about looking backwards, about thinking about the person's life and how sad it is that they're not around anymore, although of course that comes into it. Because Christians don't believe that the dead are lost forever, memorialization of the dead is strangely more to do with looking forward in hope to the time when we believe we're reunited with the dead, in a resurrection, in a new heaven and a new earth. And so Christian memorialization of the dead is an odd mixture of happy and sad, of sorrow caused by loss, but also of joyful expectation as we place our trust in God who gives us hope. And that's what I have prepared for now.
Thank you very much, Daniel. I'm just going to draw our attention to the time. We are getting into our last 10 minutes. So just to keep that in mind, as our last few speakers will be responding to the questions. Sally, we now have talking about memorialization and practices for the dead and why they matter in the Jewish tradition. Thanks, Sally.
Sure, thank you. So we have a very structured process. There's the death that I talked about, and then immediately after the death, the Shiva process starts, and that's the first 7 days of mourning. And it's very time spent at home, people coming to visit, and a candle is often lit in many people's homes during that period for the week, and mirrors are covered. We're not. It's a time to put away vanity. So there are many symbols around the Shiva time, but that's the first 7 days. We also say what's called the Kaddish prayer, which is the prayer for the dead person. And some of you will have seen those in Hollywood movies. There's quite a bit of that. Not exactly always accurately represented, but some of those words have entered the lexicon. The next period is the shloshim, and the shloshim means 30. So the first 30 days, it's another marker in time. And the Kaddish prayer is said, well, it's said the whole time, but sort of a more public, you start to come out into the public during that shloshim time. During the first 30 days, men don't shave, people don't get their hair cut. After 30 days, those sort of parts of normal life start to resume again. Then in that first year, we have the time when we put the matseva up. The matseva is the headstone. So it's depending on which countries, different countries have different customs. In the UK, it's usually 10 or 11 months after the burial, and the headstone goes up and there's wording there, whatever choice you make, your family members, a quote, whatever it is you want on your headstone. So that's another gathering together, another sort of public marking of death and the loved one that is gone. And then the anniversary of the death is called the Yahrzeit. So a year later, people get together and will say special blessings, special prayers to commemorate a year since the passing of somebody. So there is this very clear structure of time and using those dates to memorialize an individual. There are public gatherings every year on the Jewish festivals, the 3 times during the year, 3 different festivals. There is what's called Yizkor, which are the public prayers for people who have died, not just in that, well, actually not in that first year. You don't say it in the first year, it's afterwards. So after the first year, you would come to the synagogue and participate in the public prayers for the mourners, to remember people, to memorialize people. There are some other communal days, is what's called Memorial Day for Holocaust victims and Memorial Day in Israel for the fallen during the wars. And so these are more public community, global Jewish people sort of events, which are very different and there's a different sort of discussion than the private memorials. But I just wanted to highlight those as well. So I'll stop there for now so other people can have a chance to speak.
Thanks very much, Sally. Our next question is, what is the role of the ancestors in your tradition's understanding of death? And for that, I'm going to call on Kat to answer.
Hi. Okay, so in in understanding that energy can't be created or destroyed, and understanding, like we were just talking about milestones, those dates that are significant to us. The things that I encourage my clients to do as processing their grief is to take some time doing the things that they like to do with that person. And so this is a form of what cross-culturally is known as ancestor veneration, but it's actually just a way for us to like help process our grief. And so it doesn't necessarily need to be religious, but like one of the things that I do is I'll put out a cup of tea for my aunt. She was also a psychopomp. She died without ever knowing that she was able to like help cross other people over, but she was doing it constantly in her dreams and helping, she would dream about her beloved dead, and she would have these experiences and then tell them to us. And that's part of that journey is witnessing their story, bringing their story back to the family. And so ancestor veneration is really, really important. And it gives us a place that we can put our grief. The main problem with grief is that it's sort of like the opposite of the side of the coin of love. And so when you love someone and you send out that like little energetic like connection of like, I love you, and then it's not met in the way that it used to be met when the animating force was inside of the body, it feels hollow. And so we're sending out love and we want to receive it back, but there's this place that's like stuck. And so creating small rituals that allow us to connect with our beloved dead is really important. And I also want to mention, just outside of this, is that, again, as a queer person, a lot of queer people are estranged not just from their religions, but also estranged from their family of origin. And so there's not really a lot of places for a sense of safety around ancestry. So it's also okay to connect in with ancestors of like venerated, beloved queer elders who have passed. And I feel like that's a really important thing that we can do, is to remember their stories of how we have gotten here and how we have progressed in our rights and our abilities to like speak and be free. And so I think it's really important for us to understand that any sort of ancestor veneration doesn't need to be religious, but it's just really important as a connection point, as a milestone point for our own processing of our grief and our loss and our love.
Thanks, Kat. I was thinking as you were talking, and I was going to ask this, for LGBTQ plus folks who are estranged from their families of origin, as you say, can we have chosen ancestors? Essentially, we can. That's good to know, encouraging to know. Thank you. Okay, the next question in our last 4 or 5 minutes. How can people with no religious belief or faith connect with your tradition, and what is that experience like? And for that, I'm going to come back to Daniel.
So as the established church in England, as June said, the Church of England quite often does funerals for people who don't have a strong connection with Christianity, because everyone in England has a right to have their funeral conducted by their local Anglican priest. People often connect with traditional words, whether spoken or sung, hymns like Abide With Me, texts like Psalm 23, The Lord is my shepherd, John 14, in my Father's house there are many dwelling places. I think singing, saying and hearing things that have been sung, said and heard before places this person's death into a wider context, which many people find helpful. Gathering in a community building can be helpful, and Anglican parish churches are a good example of that. Wherever possible, I try and persuade people to have funerals in church, not in the crematorium. Crematorium chapels are only used for funerals, and for me that makes them a bit depressing. If a funeral takes place in church, it's happening in a building where there have been christenings and weddings, Christmas, Easter, daily, weekly worship. And again, I think putting death into that community context helps by putting it into a wider context again. But then, of course, as well as those things, there's also the specifically Christian message, which always comes through because of the specific words that we are required to use as Christian priests. So there's always a Bible reading. And the texts of the service hammer home the message that Christ was raised and therefore we can hope to be raised. So that comes through, and people may not have explicitly asked for that, but it is part of a Christian funeral. Those who come may not have that hope, and the person who died may not have that hope. But they've chosen a Christian funeral, and I think sometimes those who have lost someone, even if they don't have that hope themselves, they sometimes find comfort in the knowledge that the church has that hope, and they can find their lack of faith or their faltering faith sort of upheld by the faith of others. So there are points of connection and there are points of disconnection, and points of comfort and points of challenge. And I think that's probably quite a good thing.
Thanks very much. Now, our last question was about any particularly interesting stories. We only have barely 2 minutes left, but I know June had one. I don't know, June, can you do a 2-minute version of that story to send us off?
Well, it follows very neatly on from what Daniel has just said. It was a baby born prematurely at 6 months, and an incredibly complex family. A much wanted baby with a grandparent who was Muslim, one Roman Catholic. Father was a lapsed Catholic, and the mother wanted female language for the divine, which set me with a huge challenge of putting some sort of service together that might be appropriate for this. In an impromptu service, I'm used, of course, to saying, "Dear loving God," but I found myself resorting to Allah Ashera Aswati, Saraswati, in a strange way, whoever of you is here to help me out, really, in this complex situation. By the time of the service, I managed to work out that I would use O Divine, to whom many names are given. And that seemed to make people happy. When I preached, I said something like, "I am a Christian priest, and this is how I make sense of this. But I know all of you will want to make sense of it in whatever way you can." It was like being on a landscape that I was very familiar with, but somebody who had painted over all the signs on the signposts. But I realized that in doing this, in the presence of 2 young, I would think, Muslim men who said that was very important. And I said, "You have more life on this planet than me. Maybe you can create some for yourselves." But it was very beautiful. And I realized that this is what life might be like for an Anglican priest, 10 years down the line, when you have these multi-faith funerals and you're faced with making a ritual which will be acceptable to them all, because after all, one is serving that community, and that is one's role, it seems to me. And but it is a service that I shall remember always, both for its challenge and also for its beauty.
Thank you. That was quite a remarkable story. I think that's something that's come home to me in this. And, I mentor new palliative care volunteers in my community, and I also teach university students on what it means to think about spirituality and end-of-life care. And I think what it comes down to is that there's no way that my students or these volunteers can know and understand every single religious or spiritual tradition, right? It's impossible for them to have that kind of knowledge. Even teaching religion for the years I have, I don't feel that I have that knowledge to do that for people that I am accompanying or sitting with as they're dying. And so really, I think it comes down to, when we talk about those spiritual needs, is meeting people where they are at, listening to their needs, being present to them, and recognizing that despite this beautiful tapestry of religion and humanism and spiritual traditions that we're hearing from today, that we are all human, that we are all mortal, and so we're all fellow travelers on this route to death. And so if we can just recognize that whatever we're doing in whatever context, and however many hats you have to wear, June, that we are fellow travelers on that journey, and to be with the other person as a fellow mortal is probably the best comfort and presence that we can provide. Anyway, I want to thank all of you so much for really beautiful stories, incredible traditions and practices. I loved hearing from all of you. And so thank you for sharing your time with all of us today and at Lifting the Lid. It's been a real pleasure and an honor.
Thank you.
Thank you all.